There's a specific kind of silence that exists in a house that's mourning. It's a heavy, stagnant quiet that makes every floorboard creak sound like a footstep. In 1986, the Bowen family was living that silence. They had recently lost their mother, and the atmosphere in their Townsend, Massachusetts home was thick with grief. But soon, that silence began to break. It started with the scratching, not the frantic, scattered scratching of a mouse, but a rhythmic, deliberate dragging sound, like a fingernail being pulled slowly across the back of drywall. The Bowman girls thought it was a ghost. They prayed it was just a spirit. They were wrong, because spirits don't eat your food, spirits don't wear your clothes, and spirits certainly don't carry sharp, heavy tools. Tina Bowen was the first to notice the house leaking its secrets. It was a Tuesday evening, around 6 p.m. She was home alone doing homework in the kitchen. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator. Then, out of nowhere, the television in the living room roared to life. She walked into the room. The screen was a blizzard of black and white static. She turned it off, but as she walked back to the kitchen, she heard the click of the power button again. This time, the volume was at its maximum. She pulled the plug from the wall, her hands shaking. Over the next week, the glitches escalated. The sisters would find their bedroom furniture shifted, turned slightly, as if somebody had been sitting in their chairs, watching them sleep. They'd find the bathroom sink dripping, even though they knew they tightened the tap. One afternoon, Tina found a message scrolled across the basement wall. It was a dark reddish-brown smear that read, "I'm back. Find me." In their grief, the girls wanted to believe it was their mother trying to return. They didn't realize they were being haunted by something very much alive. The most disturbing part of the haunting wasn't what they saw, it was what they felt. The Bowen house was an older build, with hollow spaces between the walls for plumbing and wiring. The girls began to report a presence that followed them. Imagine walking down a long, narrow hallway at night. You hear a thud behind the wall to your left. You stop. The thud stops. You take 2 steps. Thump, thump. Something was pacing them from inside the structure of the house. Their father, Frank, was a skeptical man. He told the girls it was pipes, or perhaps an animal in the attic. But one night, Frank was sitting in the living room when he saw a light fixture in the ceiling vibrate. He stood on the chair and looked closely at the decorative grate on the air vent. In the darkness of the duct, he saw something glint. It looked like the reflection of a human eye. He unscrewed the grate and shone the flashlight inside. The duct was empty, but as he stood there, he realized the dust on the floor of the vent had been wiped clean. Something had been laying there, peering down at him while he watched the evening news. The ghost was finally cornered on a Friday. Frank returned home early and heard a noise in the master bedroom. He walked in expecting to see his daughters. Instead, he saw a figure standing in front of his late wife's vanity. The person was wearing his wife's dress and a blonde wig. When the figure turned around, Frank realized he was a teenage boy. His skin was the color of mushroom, pale, translucent, and covered with gray dust of fiberglass insulation. He was Daniel LaPlante, a 17-year-old neighbor who had become obsessed with the family. LaPlante didn't run. He lunged, wielding a dangerous metal tool he had gotten from their garage. After a frantic struggle, LaPlante dove into a small 12-inch utility panel hidden behind a bookshelf. When the police arrived, they pried open the wall of the house. What they found was a nightmare. LaPlante had carved out a nest between the master bedroom and the girls' room. He had been living there for months, watching them through the tiny holes he had drilled into the walls. This is where the story shifts from a horror movie into a true crime tragedy. Daniel LaPlante was eventually released on bail. The Bowen family fled the house, but the monster was now out in the world. Just weeks later, LaPlante broke into a home of another local family. He didn't hide in the walls this time. He was responsible for the tragic loss of life involving mother and her 2 young children. Daniel LaPlante is currently serving multiple life sentences. He is the reason why, to this day, people in Townsend, Massachusetts double-check their closet floors and look twice at the shadows behind their air vents. The Bowens thought they were being haunted by a loved one. They learned the hard way that things that go bump in the night aren't always looking for closure. Sometimes they're just looking for a place to hide. In 1941, the house at 3335 West Moncrief Place in Denver, Colorado, was a place of quiet routine. It was the home of Philip Peters, a 73-year-old retired railroad worker and local musician. Philip was a man of habit, but his life had recently become lonely. His wife Helen was in the hospital, leaving Philip alone in the large echoing house. But as the autumn leaves began to turn, Philip started to feel that the quiet wasn't quite right. It was as if the air in the house had grown heavy. He'd walk into the kitchen to find the back door unlocked, even though he was certain he turned the bolt. He'd find a single slice of bread missing from a new loaf. Most unsettling was the smell, a faint, musty odor that seemed to drift down from the ceiling, like something old and forgotten was breathing just out of sight. Philip Peters was a pragmatic man, but even he couldn't ignore the glitches. One evening, while practicing his guitar in the parlor, he heard the distinct creak from a floorboard upstairs. He put his guitar down and climbed the stairs, heart hammering. The hallway was empty. The doors to the bedrooms were shut. He checked the closets, the bathrooms, even under the beds. Nothing. What Phillips didn't know is he was being watched from a vantage point he never thought to check. In the ceiling of a small closet, there was a tiny 10 by 14 inch trapdoor leading to a narrow attic cubbyhole, a space so small and cramped that no one believed that a human could fit inside. But Theodore Conies was not an ordinary man. A former acquaintance of Philip, Conies had broken into the house weeks earlier. He had discovered the trapdoor and decided to make the attic his nest. He would wait until he heard the front door click as Philip left, and then, like a spider descending its web, he would drop from the ceiling to feast on Philip's leftovers and drink the coffee while it was still warm. The ghost and the man finally met on October 17, 1941. Philip had returned earlier than expected. He walked into the kitchen and found a gaunt, disheveled man standing at his refrigerator, his face covered in gray soot from the attic. Philip, despite his age, swung his cane at the intruder, but Conies was younger and desperate. He grabbed a heavy iron stove shaker, a solid piece of metal, and in a fit of panicking rage, he assaulted Philip, ultimately claiming his life right there in the kitchen. When neighbors found Philip later that evening, the scene was deeply disturbing, but the police were immediately baffled. The house was locked from the inside. Every window was latched, every door was bolted. There was no sign of forced entry, and nothing valuable had been taken. It was as if Philip had been attacked by a phantom that had vanished into thin air. For the next 9 months, the house on Moncrief Place became known as the Ghost House of Denver. Philip's wife, Helen, eventually returned to live in the home where her husband had passed, but the peace didn't last. Helen began to hear the same noises Philip had heard, the sound of the footsteps in the attic, the clicking of the silverware in the middle of the night. Her neighbors told her she was just grieving, that her mind was playing tricks on her, but Helen knew better. She began to notice a shadow moving across the walls that didn't belong to any furniture. The musty smell had returned, stronger than ever. She eventually became so terrified that she moved out, leaving the house vacant. But even as the house sat empty, the neighbors would see a pale, skeletal face peering out from the upstairs curtains. only for the face to vanish the moment they blinked. In July 1942, police finally decided to do a final sweep of the haunted house. As two officers walked through the upstairs hallway, they heard a faint click from the ceiling. They looked up and saw a pair of thin skeletal legs retreating into the tiny closet trapdoor. They hauled the man down. It was Theodore Coney's. He was so thin and gaunt that he looked like a living corpse. He had been living in the 27-inch high crawl space for 9 months, surrounded by his own filth and the canned goods he had taken from the pantry. One detective remarked that a man would have to be a spider to survive in such conditions. Theodore Coney's was sentenced to life in prison. The story of the Denver Spider-Man remains one of the most terrifying reminders that the most dangerous ghosts aren't spirits at all. They are the people hiding in spaces we never think to check. Thanks for watching. If you have a true story, send it to acestruestories@gmail.com. If you have an idea for a future video, leave a comment, and don't forget to like and subscribe. Remember, there's always another story.